Visa, welcome to the show. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So I came across, I jumped on Twitter earlier on this year, as we discussed before,
Nice.
and I came across you. I'm not too sure how, but you are probably one of my favorite follows, one of the favorite people I'm following because of the eclectic, because I never know what's going to come out. I never know when I see what you post, what's going to
Neither do I.
Yeah. So, and I realized, having done some, when I was doing some preparation for this and just, going through some of your tweets, that one of the hardest things you probably do is explain what you do.
Yeah, true.
So when people ask you, hey, Visa, so what do you do? I mean, it's a terrible question to open up to anyone, but how do you respond? When someone says, what do you do? How do you respond?
So I try to calibrate my response to what I sense the person is asking. Well, even that is, there's layers to it. So I'm reminded now of I'm not sure if it was a joke or a koan, maybe both, but someone was saying that when you ask some like Zen master, when you ask them a spiritual question, like what's the meaning of life or something, he'll answer in some mundane way, like, oh, it's sweeping the floor. And when you ask him like a mundane question, like, oh, what should we do for dinner? And he'll answer with a spiritual answer, like, we should, I don't know, feast on our souls or something. I don't know, some crazy shit. And the point of that is he's being kind of playful, right? So he's trying to receive the spirit of the question, but he doesn't want to give like a boring answer that, kind of fits entirely within the person's expectations of what was going to be answered. So you want to surprise people a little bit, but at the same time, you don't want to go like completely off the rails and answer in gibberish. Or there's some like performance artists and comedians who try to do, like Jim Carrey had a period of time where he was kind of responding to things in very like outlandish ways to almost shock and confuse the audience. So where I am right now is I think I try to challenge myself as well as to challenge people to kind of be a little bit more imaginative. And so what do I do in the context of our conversation? Well, to make a living, I do marketing consulting, but that's just what I do to pay the bills. What I really do, I think, is I am playing publicly with ideas and perspectives. And so I do that with tweets, I do it with essays, in just every form of interaction. I think I'm trying to demonstrate a way of interfacing with reality, a way of interfacing with other people, a way of interfacing with ideas in a way that is fun, in a way that's nourishing, in a way that's surprising, exciting. And yeah, so how I frame that is something that I change all the time, because I don't want to get too stuck on, oh, I'm an essayist, therefore I only write essays, or oh, I'm a consultant, therefore you should come to me with a certain kind of thing. So I try to play. So I'm like a guy playing on Twitter.
Okay. So what's the story that led to where you are today? How did you go from being brought into the world as Visa all the way to our conversation today? What was the general what's the general story?
Right. So the funny thing to me is that, to me, what I do just feels natural. It doesn't feel, it feels like, so there are a lot of things about the way I am that to me feel obvious. And in interacting with people along the way, I have come to realize pretty slowly and pretty late that it's not actually equally obvious to everybody else. They don't operate with the same set of assumptions. And so I guess how I would tell my story, which I was recently telling someone else, was, when I was a child, I wasn't super close to my family. I mean, we had a decent family household, decent kind of average, unremarkable kind of NPC family life. And then when my parents brought me to the library for the first time, it blew my mind. It's like, oh my God, like every book is a portal into another universe, right? You're reading about Egypt and dinosaurs and all kinds of crazy stuff. So that blew my mind when I was 4 or 5, right? And I would borrow books all the time. I would borrow my mom's library card and borrow like 8 to 12 books at a time next to my bed, and I would be reading all the time. And when I encountered the internet, so I was about maybe 7 or 8, that blew my mind again, because now it's like, here is a library, here is the kind of global hyper library, and you can contribute directly to it. So before that, I used to think, oh, one day maybe I'll become an author and I get to participate in this process of librarying, right? Like there's a library and people participate, and I've received, knowledge and wisdom and love from authors, and I want to give back to that process. That felt very obvious and natural to me. And then when I got internet access, I was like, oh my God, I don't even need to wait until I become like a published author, or I don't need to get a publishing agent or anything like that.
But you saw that participating in that creation, that you saw that as quite obvious, because I feel that as a lot of people, when they grow up, they see the world, they don't participate within the world, they just observe it. But early on, you were like, no, I can contribute to this volume of work. So I can actually be a participant, not just an observer.
Yeah, that seemed very natural to me. And I guess a kind of side story to that is, and I'm still figuring out just how intertwined this is. So I'm a Singaporean Tamil. I'm a minority race. So most of Singapore is Singaporean Chinese. And I'm tall, unusually tall for a Singaporean. I'm left-handed. There are many, many ways in which I'm kind of misfit. And so from a very young age, I was always kind of repeatedly called out. I have a strange name relative to most people. And so I'm very used to always being singled out, always being called out for, so in school, if there's like a group project, like all my group mates would pick me to like be the one presenting. And it just kind of, a lot of my life experience has kind of conditioned me to assume that I'm supposed to speak up, or I'm supposed to participate, I'm supposed to, take charge in a way. So that's kind of a side thread. But yeah, so going back to the internet, when I had internet access, I was excited about the possibility of contributing directly. And so I had I set up my own homepage. I had like a guest book that people could sign and things like that. I put together like links to my favorite video game sites and stuff like that. And I just kept doing more of that. So when I was in school, my friends had blogs, and blogs back then were like Facebook statuses, basically. It'd be like, I went to school today, and then I met my friends, and we went to the arcades after school or something like that. And we just did that. And at some point, I was on LiveJournal, I think, and there was a LiveJournal community called like SG_LJRS, Singaporean live journalists. And I was like, oh, wow, cool. Here are other people like me who are publishing stuff, like whatever small talk kind of things. And I wanted to contribute to that. And so I wrote some like 16-year-old idealistic commentary piece about, hey, let's be a more gracious society. Let's be, and I got like 10 comments, which at the time when I was like 15, 16 years old, I was like, it blew my mind. Like I can write something and receive 10 comments from strangers. And so I just did more and more of that. And so, when Quora came around, I was posting on Quora. When Twitter came around, I was tweeting, and I was always kind of participating in producing content, I guess, in writing, essays, whatever the case. And yeah, so eventually more and more people started taking notice, and I was getting like retweets and shares and replies, and I started getting on people's radars, I guess, and that eventually brought me to you.
Mm-hmm. And that brought you work. It's kind of been like the act of creating in general has been the catalyst for everything that's happened to you to date.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you're Singaporean. You're from Singapore, and Singapore is a pretty interesting place. It's as you said, it's really diverse. There's a number of different races represented. It's a new country. It only came about in the middle of last century. So when you I'm from Australia. I lived in a number of different countries. So the issue of identity is an interesting one to me. So given that Singapore is a new country and doesn't really have so much of an old traditional national identity, and there's a whole variety of, there's this mishmash of cultures where you're celebrating Chinese New Year and Deepavali, Hari Raya, all these different things. How do you think, and the fact that you grew up basically connected to the internet, connected to the world, you're basically you're a netizen. So how do you think of yourself in terms of identity? Like, who are you in the context of the world at large?
So there are many layers to this, and we could probably spend multiple hours discussing this. But it's so even with, let's say, okay, where do I start? I think first of all, if you ask me what identity is, I think it's primarily an interface. So it's, there's this story of like this guy who like went into the jungle and he lived off the land for like almost 20 years, I think. Like once in a while he would sneak the civilization and like steal food and stuff, but mostly he was living in his own. And so the journalist who finally interviewed him at the end of the whole thing asked him kind of, what was it like? How did you feel being, away from people? And he said something like, I forgot I existed, because there was no one he had to perform a coherent identity to. And so in the absence of anybody else for you to say, oh, my name is so-and-so, or, I do this, I do that, right? When there's no need for it to interact with anybody else, your identity, it appears to me that your identity just kind of dissolves. And I think, if you read up about people's experiences with psychedelics and hallucinogens, or like intense meditation, or just this, there's a whole bunch of different ways you can experience this, but there is this state that people attain, which is like the identity collapse, identity dissolution. And I mean, it never lasts very long, because people eventually go back into society or communities where you have to interact with other people. And when you have to interact with other people, you have to come up with an interface. So like my face, your face interface, right? And so the interesting thing about identity is that it can be very, very multifaceted. Faceted is also face, right? And it depends on kind of who you're facing. So, when I travel anywhere in the world, usually, and people meet me, like, so when I'm in Thailand or Philippines or the States even, people tend to assume that I'm Indian from India, because, like, I guess statistically, people who look like me are likelier to be from India. There's a billion of them in India. So it's likely that I'm probably from India. It's a good guess. Except when I go to India. So when I go to India, they know that I don't quite, I don't dress the same way they do. I don't speak the same way they do. My accent is slightly different. And so they know that I'm not Indian. They're like, oh, are you Malaysian? Are you Singaporean? Like they can tell. And so it has been interesting to me to try to figure out an identity that serves me, that's useful to me in my like daily life or my longer term life even, but isn't kind of a burden, or like a kind of a gilded cage. Wait, yeah. So if sometimes I wake up and I'm like, I wish I didn't have to care about my identity at all. I do, like, even am I a man? Am I a Indian man, brown man, Singaporean? Like, I don't want to care about any of those things. I just want to play with ideas and play video games or have fun and not have to care about who I so-called am. But at the same time, you can't escape the fact that people are always going to have assumptions about who you are or where you're from. And there are kind of pros and cons to having an identity. And so I try to maximize the benefits and minimize the costs by being kind of self-authored, self-constructed in a way. The self is a construct, but like you can inspect element and kind of adjust and modify, but you can't completely switch things out entirely. And I say that, I'm a god. You have to believe. I mean, okay, it's messy, but like, yeah, there are variables you can play with, and there are some things that people will accept immediately when you tell them that I am a extrovert, right, or whatever. I can maybe decide that I'm an introvert and then change that part of my identity. Maybe. I mean, it's slightly flexible, but not entirely. But there's a lot of space to play with. And there's something else I wanted to talk about in this context, which is, you mentioned about like Singaporean identity being a relatively young country. That's true. But at the same time, the interesting thing to me is that, Southeast Asian history goes way back. It goes back hundreds of years. And Southeast Asia in general is actually kind of different than most of the rest of the world. And that's because it's along a global shipping trading route. So like from the 1400s all the way to the 1900s, like just, so you have Malays, you have Chinese, you have Arabs, you have Indians, you have all kinds of people who came to trade. And, they when they came to trade, they also brought along their architecture, their religions, their cultural artifacts, and so on. And so there's a lot of mixing that happens, a lot of intermingling. And, so they're like Peranakans who are like Chinese with Malay roots and stuff like that. And so, the kind of maritime empires that used to exist. So there used to be the Majapahit Empire in the 1600s and the Srivijaya Empire in the 1400s. And if you read up about those things, it's very, I believe that there is such a thing as a kind of Southeast Asian identity that is deeper and older than any of the nation states. And the more history I read, the more I relate to that and the more I identify with it, which is, to be Southeast Asian, whether you're Indonesian or Malaysian or Singaporean, to be Southeast Asian is to be someone who is very comfortable with contradictions, and because you live full of contradictions, right? So the example I give is like Indonesia is, I think, practically the largest Muslim state in the world. It's like a Muslim majority country of 200 million people, but like they used to be a Buddhist Hindu kingdom. And so like their national airline is called Garuda Airlines, and Garuda is like the Hindu symbol. And it's just that contradiction is just natural and normal to them, which would be pretty strange to, like imagine, let's say like Americans with like a Muslim symbol that is, I mean, I'm sure if you dig into it, you'll find some interesting complexity and stuff in the background that people tend to gloss over. But I'm especially curious about these things because I feel like what happened to Southeast Asia in the 1400s through the 1900s is almost like a teaser for what is about to happen to the whole world, because what happened to Southeast Asia happened because of maritime trade. Like there was that kind of everything around that path of cultural exchange, everything around it just gets weird, like because there's so much exchange going on. And now like the global shipping route is like the international internet all over the whole world, and people are not ready for it, right? You can see the cultural wars is happening now because people grew up kind of exposed to very homogenous cultures, and like you go to the same church and everyone looks like you and so on and so forth. And now everyone is being exposed to people from dramatically different cultures, from dramatically different backgrounds and perspectives and values, and people are not very skilled at playing with that, and so you get a lot of antagonism and violence and conflict. And so I almost see it without holding it too preciously and too kind of turning it into a trap or box, is that I almost see my Singaporean identity or my Southeast Asian identity as kind of a how would you say, like a light, maybe like a possible sign of how things could be navigated. Like I think I possess, and I mean, people have said this as well, so it's not just me being full of myself, but like I think I have, through partially by accident, partially out of necessity, I've kind of developed a way of navigating kind of cultural crosswinds, and that is a very maritime Southeast Asian thing to do. And I think that the world needs more people who are able to do that, so that we can navigate the cultural wars we see right now. It's still like season 1 or season 2. Like it's gonna get way crazier once like 4 billion people more come online. So we are. Yeah, so it's just a thing. That's kind of how I think about it, and I'm very comfortable, or I say I'm very comfortable with the idea of like my identity being something that is flexible, that it could change. Like so today I might focus on one thing, but like next year I might focus on another. I think the ability to kind of modify your own identity and play up certain bits, play down certain bits, and kind of improvise, and that gives you a certain freedom. I do think at the beginning it can be unsettling and kind of like there's nothing stable to stand on, so it's kind of like
then you realize that you're actually okay and that you can actually continue to adapt. I think it's something that a lot of people come to realize, and I hopefully many people come to realize increasingly that who they are and their identities and what they know is subject to change. And that they become people who are capable, like if they shift their notion of themselves that they are people who are capable of changing, then it suddenly gets better for everyone, because people are less in there, tend to be less confrontational. They tend to be more empathetic because they realize that there are other ways of being and that they can change, that they themselves can change. And if that's the case, then everyone else can as well.
Yep, exactly that. Yeah.
So I feel I cut you off on a bit of a good.
No, it's fine. So it's we were talking about identities and being able to experiment with like different facets of your identities, even having a multifaceted identity, right? A friend of mine was telling me a story about his ex. I think his brother-in-law or something. Like, so his brother-in-law invested like his whole life into being a successful investment banker. Like that was his dream, I guess. And it wasn't that he's passionate about banking. He just wanted, and he isn't even really passionate about money. He just had this idea that, oh, if I become an investment banker, I will make a lot of money and I will be happy. Like he got invested. He got invested in the idea of being an investment banker. And so, he did not have fun during his teenage years, for example. So like when his friends were partying or whatever, he's like, no, I'm my eye is on that prize and I'm going to study hard and I'm going to not socialize. And just all the way, he just kept making decisions that kind of led him to that holy grail. And then like, I think he was successful for a few years. He bought like expensive cars and stuff. And then he got laid off. And then like after that, like he totally crashed. He became like miserable, depressed, like he's playing video games every day. And like his wife wants to leave him now because he's just so despondent. And, I look at that and I'm like, I mean, I'm sorry for him and for his wife. And like, it's a sad mess all around. But that was precisely the outcome that I was afraid of when I was a teenager. I remember when I was in junior college and like my teachers and friends were all like, oh, study hard, get a good job and, everything will be fine. I was like, you don't know that. Like, you don't know that things are not going to change radically and the thing that you assume is going to work out might not. Like, what are you going to do if everything that you've pinned your hopes on doesn't work out, right? Like I've always been very wary of that. So I've always felt it's very important to have kind of multiple sources of meaning even. So, you should have like, so and there's nothing wrong with wanting to be an investment banker or a startup CEO or whatever it is that gives you meaning and joy. But like you should probably, I think you should probably diversify your meaning portfolio in a sense, and so that you should have someone in your life that you care about who doesn't care about any of those things that are your primary meaning sources, so that if and when that collapses, like you have other ways of not crashing terribly from my life is meaningful to my life is totally meaningless.
Yeah. What do you? When it comes to meaning, how do you, I don't want to ask how do you find it, but meaning is like, it's a topic of the times in the way with the rise of Jordan Peterson and nihilism and just, the despondency with which many people seem to interact with the world. But kind of just, a lot of people are kind of zombies in a way, their lives perhaps completely devoid of meaning. How do you use meaning? Well, from the outside, it seems to me that your life is filled with meaning, and it guides you in a way. It's meaning, and I think of meaning in this way as well. It's meaning is a signal. It's a flag. It's a direction. So how does meaning, in a way, guide you, and how do you interact with meaning in the world?
So yeah. And this is a common theme in how I do a lot of things, which is that I approach it from many different angles. So that again, like if my first approach doesn't work out or turns out to be bullshit, I can always just like let that one go and switch to another. I think when I was a teenager, first of all, again, so I grew up in Singapore, and so like my parents are Hindu, and I went to like a Anglican Christian kindergarten. And I had friends who are Muslim. I had friends who are like Buddhist or Taoist. And so I always witnessed that there were many different people with many different beliefs about, the afterlife or beliefs about spirituality and all that. And, I was reading about ancient Egyptian pharaohs and ancient Egyptian gods and Roman gods and Greek gods. And there was a period of time when I was maybe 10, I was super into all those like Norse pantheons and all that. And it just was always obvious to me that there are many possible stories you can tell. So I think about things in terms of story. And so, there are many possible stories you can tell. And it's not clear that anybody has a monopoly on the correct story. And it seems likely that there is no correct story. There's just stories that resonate with you. And I think I have come to think of stories almost as like emotional, I want to say emotional talismans, though I'm not sure if that's the right frame. But basically, so as human beings, we can't escape stories. Like, it's how we function beyond the most basic, primitive, primal ape kind of.
Yeah, I think stories are actually the form through which language and
the current.
But it's like it's how the information gets packaged. That's resonant with
it's
our
a currency, I think. Right?
Yeah,
I think stories are probably the currency of meaning, maybe, or meanings. I mean, you get it. It's there are these things that we can play with.
I see them as vessels in a way. They're more like vessels. They carry their things. Yeah,
that's fine. Yeah, so I guess maybe you could think of meaning as like, so how is it manifest? So I try to ground things as much as possible. And by ground, I mean like relate to it personally. So I mean, I might have had a phase when I was maybe like 17 or 18 when I was interested in like these super abstract kind of hypothetical thought experiment type things. But these days, I'm always very curious to relate every idea or curiosity or whatever back to kind of my life. And when I say my life, I don't necessarily mean like my practical day-to-day life, but just kind of my concept or my relationship with everything. And so I think of so you there's no life without story, right? So everybody inherits some stories, whether you like it or not. So you inherit stories about what nation state you're from, what I think everyone inherits these days, like the basic kind of capitalist-ish idea of you gotta, like, the good life is you have to make enough money that you don't need to depend on other people. I mean, just I don't want to get too caught up in the details of that, because people will argue about the specifics, and I don't want to argue about the specifics so much as point out that when we go to school, or when your parents chose to have kids, just every decision happens within a broader framework of a kind of patchwork of stories. And what we get to do if we see it. So first you have to see it, and once you see it, you have to decide that you want to get involved. Once you see that everything around you is kind of a patchwork of stories, you can choose to be deliberate about the stories that you navigate by, and you can question the existing stories that you've inherited. And I think sometimes so the whole trope of the edgy nihilistic teenager who's kind of like, oh, the man is out to get me, that kind of thing, like it's almost a necessary learning phase where you reject your old stories, to try and find kind of step outside of your indoctrination or your inheritance, and to try and then reorient yourself and find stories that are right for you. Although very often what happens is people run out of energy. I think so. There is that youthful rebellion, and then after that they're like, "Oh, I need to get a job, and I need to
life catches up.
Move on with my life." Yeah, and then so when life catches up with you, it's kind of at some point people start thinking, "I don't have the privilege. I don't have the luxury of thinking about my story anymore. Like I got to pay the bills. I got to get by with my day-to-day life." But the thing is, when you do that, it's not like you stop playing and the game is over. It's more of like you stop playing and now you have relinquished control of your narrative to whatever is the prevailing narrative of the time. And so I never want to do that. So like, in that way, I am permanently invested in always being a kind of edgy teenager, in a sense. Like I never want I think the day you kind of give up on that is the day you kind of
you die.
It's a kind of death. It's a kind of
death of just
you get it, right? It's your soul has become you've become a kind of zombie, or and what frustrates me sometimes is the people who describe this. Sometimes they get very animated in how. Like they want to put down other people and be like, oh, you guys are all zombies, that you're capitalist zombies, and you're which I find needlessly antagonistic and dismissive. I think people, like children. So if you watch children playing, like little kids, they are kind of making up stories on the fly with each other, and it's very silly and small, but it's practice for bigger story experimentation, I think. But then once you go to school and there's that, you can kind of think of school and corporate life and like that kind of space as a homogenization of story. Like everyone is supposed to, whether like literally or kind of implicitly, everyone is supposed to, like, you get to experiment with stories a little bit on the side, but the main story remains, and you have to find your role and your space and your meaning and whatever it relative within that main story. And some people find that that's very. Some people like it. I think lots of people.
Well, it's because it's easy. It's easy to.
You don't need to think about it.
No. And I think we're at a point in time now where the story has just been the book's been torn into shreds, and
right. Now the carpet's pulled out.
Yeah. And it's kind of terrifying for many people, and including myself. Because suddenly you don't just go to university and get a degree, or you don't just go through right. You stay on the track and then you live your life, you have kids and you do all this sort of stuff, because we now have global internet access. We can now genetically engineer life. We have climate change. Right. We have the fact that you and I can have this conversation and potentially make a living off doing ridiculous things online. We have the potential of all, we have so much potential. And the opportunity cost of a particular action could be, who knows what else we could be doing. So that it's kind of just paralyzing in a way, and it's terrifying to actually. Right. I think it's terrifying to, in a way, choose to have the choose to, I guess, chart a course through the unknown. And we're also kind of punished in a way by society at the moment, because we're all living in the old story. The old story is in its death throes, whereas right now we're kind of in the midst of trying to create a new one. And it's difficult to try and be in that new story, I think.
Right. And the interesting thing is, people don't realize how fragile the default story has always been. Because it looks stable enough. You see banks and schools and buildings look stable, right? And it's just, if you haven't read much history. So I think one of the things so I remember being so scared even and anxious as a teenager, and it seemed like most of my friends were not. And now that I look back, I think it's because I was more sensitive to history than so I was reading about, pharaohs and shit back when I was a child, right? And oh wow, these guys were king, they built pyramids, they were crazy successful, and they had their stories, and thousands of years people were kind of invested in that, and that whole shit is gone. It's just, and now it's ruins and stuff. And who's to say that whatever it is that the whole kind of white picket fence middle class life that we have after kind of post World War II life, the idea that it's stable was just never. It was always obvious to me that was not the case. But people are why are you being so dramatic? Let's just go and get student loans and go work in the media and then stuff like that. And and so there's this. I'm pulling up some quotes that I have in my notes that I think you might like. So here's a quote from Joseph Campbell, right? Who wrote The Hero of a Thousand Faces. Yeah. This is a quote. It's a quote about LSD, but I find that it also applies to a lot of things. So he says, okay, the LSD phenomenon is interesting. It's an intentionally achieved schizophrenia with the expectation of a spontaneous remission, which, however, does not always follow. Yoga, too, is intentional schizophrenia. One breaks away from the world, plunging inwards, and the ranges of visions experienced are, in fact, the same as that of a psychosis. But what is the difference? What's the difference between a psychotic or LSD experience and a yogic or a mystical? The plunges are all into the same deep inward sea. Of that, there can be no doubt. and the symbolic figures encountered are in many instances identical, but there's an important difference. And the difference, to put it sharply, is equivalent to that between a diver who can swim and one who cannot. The mystic, endowed with native talents for this sort of thing and following stage by stage the instructions of a master, enters the waters and finds he can swim, whereas the schizophrenic, unprepared, unguided, and ungifted has fallen or intentionally plunged and is drowning. Right. So this is Campbell talking about doing like drugs, but it's also, like narrative, depending on how galaxy brain you want to take this, but narratives are drugs in a way, like they, and in a very literal sense, neuroscientists folks might disagree, but I'm being kind of hyperbolic here, but the narrative in your head shapes the way you interpret reality, and that shapes the way whether you see something as a threat or something as a potential reward, and you receive internal, you self-regulate internally.
That's actually true. We how we choose to engage with things that produce anxiety. If we choose to engage with them rather than them just happening to us, I think there's less of an anxious response. And right. I interviewed this meditation researcher at Harvard, and we basically came to the we were discussing about how meditation is in a way a means to, it does lots of different things, but one of the things it does is help you craft the lens through which you view the world. And what we've learned is that the world is irreducibly complex. And what that means is that we have to filter it in some way, shape, or form. And our goals dictate that filter. And how we select our goals, the goals that are like in here, is actually, I don't think we know how we do that yet. How do we go from I want that to really wanting it to the core of your being? But that action or that decision or that change dictates or change, it influences how you see the world. And then once that happens, then a path can kind of present itself to you. Or like the actions or the things that are in the world that can help you get to wherever you want to go, they're always there. But now that you've changed your filter in such a way that you can actually see them. So anyway, just so you're exactly, it's right.
Exactly that, right? So it's all about so we are all having the same experience. Effect. I mean, we're all inhabiting the same underlying reality, but our subjective experiences are so dramatically different because we have different frames and lenses based on how we interpret the data that we're receiving. And so the challenge and it's quite sad sometimes when you meet people who are, they might be smart, they might be, great on a lot of fronts, but they might be trapped in some way because they're holding on to a little too rigidly to some frame of how things are. And I think if we all look back on our own kind of life experiences, we all also have, examples of clinging too tightly to some way of seeing things, and such that each new thing that comes along, you confirm your bias. And so
I think we do that because we construct ourselves with these ideas, and it's through that self-construction. If that idea comes under threat, suddenly who we are in some way comes under threat, and we become fragmented.
So a big kind of step, like kind of a transformational step is going from, so first of all, you have to recognize that you have a model of reality that is pretty much tied up to your identity. And then you want to start experimenting with alternate models of reality. And the challenge is to recognize that there are many models of reality, and different models do not necessarily threaten you, right? Like just because, and you can playfully try to experiment with what if something else was true? What if everything I've assumed turns out to be wrong? And the challenge is to experiment with that while not totally losing your shit, which is, I mean, I get that it's pretty easy for me to say now that I have already kind of gotten comfortable with this. But when I look back on my own life, and when I get DMs on Twitter from young people sometimes, and they're going through a lot of chaos in their heads. And when I look back, and I want to comfort them, but at the same time, when I look back on my own, there are moments that some people describe as like the dark night of the soul, right? The collapse of all meaning, and then you realize that, oh shit, everything that you thought was meaningful is subjective, and so what is anything, right? And I think that, it's almost maybe unavoidable. Like if you want to get to the point where you are comfortably surfing on the waves, you almost have no choice, maybe, but to sometimes have experiences where you feel like you're drowning, and the anxiety and fear that comes with that is very, very real. And I'm not sure if there's anything that can, like, ultimately you have to face that yourself. Like, if you're lucky, you may have a peer or a mentor that you can trust who will, they might like hold your hand, like literally or metaphorically. They might just be there with you and say, hey, like, I know like it feels like your world is collapsing right now, and it's correct what you're feeling, like that. Not to dismiss your feelings, like your feelings are valid, but like I've been there before and I came out of it, and it will pass for you as well. Like that can be somewhat reassuring, but also not. It's still ultimately the dark night of the soul is completely dark, and you really kind of go through that desperate, anxious thing yourself. I mean, I pendulum back and forth on this. I feel like having done reading and knowing that other people have been through it and come out the other side stronger for it and kind of better adjusted, definitely allowed me to go through it better. But at the same time, yeah, that's I think that's the limit of what you can do for someone else going through that. And the and you have to be careful not to,
you don't want to rob them of their experience as well. You don't want to save them in a way, because some of these experiences can be so formative and teach you lessons that really
and kind of the guru paradox or the guru trap is, if you provide too much structure and guidance, then they are just, they are going through the experience holding your hand, and it's like, now what's happened is that they've discarded their old meaning model, but now they've imprinted on you, right?
What's that saying? Like a calm sea has never made a good sailor, or something like that.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. And so the thing that sometimes I sometimes joke with my friends, like my friends sometimes joke with me that, hey, you're gonna end up becoming like a guru figure on Twitter because of what you're doing, and like kids come to me and like, oh, like you seem to have it all figured out, and I have to be like, no, dude, I'm just some guy. Like don't like thank you for your kind, for seeing what I do and appreciating it. I appreciate that, but like you have to be careful right now, because if you start to kind of pedestalize someone else, that's a way of kind of almost abdicating your own responsibility for your own meaning making. It's like, oh, here's this really smart guy. Here's this Elon Musk or this Nassim Taleb or this, whoever these guys are. And they are good at what they do and they have whatever. But like, there's this danger of thinking that some red hat or pink hat or something you can wear and put on a badge and like, I'm done. Like I have now found meaning in life by subscribing to this other worldview. Like that's very dangerous, and it becomes, it's something that you always have to be vigilant to avoid, I believe.
Yeah. So this conversation reminds me of a thread or something of yours. I can't remember it specifically, but it was along the lines of you going through some sort of, how would I describe it? Like a reinvention every 6 months or so. Like something seems to happen for some reason, and it's not really, you don't bring it about. It's not something like you click open a template that you've got and like, all right, time to reinvent myself. Let's go through step 1 to 10. There may be something going on inside that like brings this about. So can you talk to me a bit about that? Because I think a lot of people probably go through the same thing. And what have you learned from this? What has it been like to be constantly becoming over the past 29 years?
Oh, I love it. So, again, the thing that one of my deepest fears again is kind of not living, right? So like imagine like you kind of go to work and you come home and you watch TV and you go to bed, and then you go to work and you do that like a little bit, and you're like, I'm tired. I don't have time to kind of take stock of my life. I don't have time to do like wild, crazy things. So I'll do it next month. I'll do it next year maybe. And then you look down, you look up, and holy shit, you're like 20 years older now, and like you're in your 50s or 60s. Like that's my nightmare scenario. Like holy shit, like just without paying much attention, you kind of accidentally drifted off, and your whole life is, or like substantial parts of your life have kind of fallen out of your conscious attention. And I mean, I look back on my life and there are like little pockets of time here and there where I'm like, holy shit, what was I doing from, ages 23 to 25? I mean, I do have, this is why I journal obsessively, so that I can always kind of look back and not feel like, wow, life kicked me around and I wasn't there for my own. Not daily. I tweet daily, so I can look back at my tweets and kind of figure it out. I try to journal. At this point, so I have had periods of time where I'm like, okay, I'm going to journal every single day for 30 days or whatever. And I have experimented with those exercises. So I have a good enough relationship with myself at this point that I can kind of just improvise and trust myself to figure it out. But like, what I was getting at with that was, sometimes people say things like, my dad wasn't in my life, or like kind of my partner doesn't pay attention to me, or there's that class of thing, like somebody wasn't there he was at his child's game but he was on his phone, that kind of thing. And I actually think about that first and foremost, like in the context of our own lives. Like you seldom hear from people literally like, I wasn't there for my own life, but it's a thing that happens to a lot of people. And if you read like deathbed regrets, I think the number one deathbed regret is people saying, I wish I had the courage to live a life that was true to who I am. And so they regret all the things that they didn't do, and they regret the kind of I guess when you're gonna die, so if you find out that, hey, tonight's your last night on Earth, you're like, holy shit! All the times why did I not do all the things? Like, worried what other people are thinking? Fuck that! Like, So that's my main worry. And so you were asking about like the reinvention thing. I don't know if I would use the phrase reinvention per se. How would I describe it?
It's like an evolution, perhaps, like a burning away of the old and a attaching of the new in some way.
Yeah. So I have many small experiences like these. I'm a little bit wary not to avoid kind of over constructing like this very elegant narrative of like, I have hero's journey and I went there. I mean, so sometimes I experiment with like micro stories. So for example, like I went to San Francisco this year in May, and it was a wonderful experience for me. And like in the context of my life, like my personal story, like, I spent most of my life in Singapore. I've visited around Southeast Asia. I've been to India. I've been to like Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines. But this is my first time traveling across to the other side of the planet. And I was meeting friends and I was alone. And it was just, it fit very nicely into like a very formative, almost spiritual experience. And so I do allow myself to enjoy that story. Like, oh wow, like, I'm like Cinderella going to the ball, or this is my kind of, I've made it in life when finally I get to see the other side of the world. Like, so I do let myself enjoy that. I don't believe in being like some kind of harsh stoic that doesn't enjoy things. Like, what's the point of it, right? So I do enjoy that, but at the same time I try to, kind of like post credits scene is, sure, at the same time it's also just another experience, and you can have more experiences, and you don't need to get super invested in one particular story. You know what? I think the simplest way to describe this is actually I navigate by boredom. And so when I get bored of something, I just turn it off and go to something else. And I think that's actually the most reliable, useful way for me to approach this. So sometimes people, like, you ever follow someone on Twitter or somewhere else and they're like a mega celebrity maybe, and they have a few good ideas, but like after like a year of following them, you're like, oh, this guy's saying the same shit he said last year, and then you get bored. Like I think that happens to myself. So I am my own. I'm like my audience zero, right? I'm the first guy who's reading my stuff, and like when I start to get bored of my stuff, I'm like, I believe that it's very precious and important to. Like when you get bored of something, like your taste is telling you that this is not worth your time anymore, or it's not interesting anymore. And that's like very, very, very precious thing. And so I think of, it's just, so my process of reinvention or whatever, it's, if I wake up thinking, when am I going to reinvent myself next? I think that's you're almost trying too hard to make something happen, and then it'll elude you.
So
maybe.
I was more thinking about my point was more along the lines of what do you think led to those crises in a way, and how then did you move past them, or what was it? What are the sorts of things that you did? And I guess you're saying that it was actually boredom with what you were doing, and that you realized that there were other.
Yeah, it could be a class. Right. It could be a different class of boredom. It could be like, so frustration is a kind of boredom in a way. I mean, they're all kind of related. Anxiety, I guess. So it's really about being sensitive to your own feelings. And I think, I sometimes tell people so the three things that you need, I think, are sensitivity which is to make sense of inputs, smarts, which is to process those inputs, and strength, which is to take action based on those inputs. And very broadly, most people understand that it's good to be smart, and most people understand that it's good to be strong, like in those kind of cargo culty, like, oh, you're so smart, oh, you're so strong. But like you seldom hear people think of sensitivity as a virtue or a value. But like, at the heart of all of this, I think it is sensitivity as in being attuned to your own feelings. And, when you learn to be sensitive to other people's feelings, then you can it's almost like a social superpower. Like you can tell you may figure out when someone is having a bad day even before they realize it, because you notice that, hey, like you might ask, hey, you're frowning. Why are you frowning? They're like, oh, I guess, and then people are drawn to you. But yeah, so you're asking about like, how do you navigate those things?
I love those three S's, by the way. I think those quite profound. Yeah.
Yes,
the three S's. It's a wonderful list. It's made for the internet.
Right. Yeah, I have a thread, obviously.
Of course.
But, with regards to kind of reinvention, I'm sure like Campbell again probably has some good stuff on this, which is kind of so again, all of these are kind of narrative challenges. Like the reality, like you said, reality is irreducibly complex. But like we need narratives, and we need kind of. I think a tiny letter that I sent out recently, an email list, was I asked my friends the question: how do you divide the chapters of your life? Because you can make it like this to this, or you can even make it into like three. You could split the same 5 years into like before this and after this, or you could make it, the first and a half year, second and a half year, third. So how you choose to divide things, it's something I think you can even, you may not even know what the correct, if there is even a correct division, but you may not know what the correct division points are until like much later on. So I would say I try to be experimental. I try to be sensitive. But
do you try to be sensitive, or do you find that you're already just sensitive as it is? I feel like you were born within a degree.
Oh no, I don't think so at all. So I am not a naturally sensitive person. Like my sensitivity is very much self-taught. So like when I was young, I was very, so like I grew up in contexts where being sensitive was definitely a weakness, I think, where I was from. And I would say like a lot of the confusion and stress of my teenage years were I didn't know what I was feeling even. And even so,
that may not be because you weren't sensitive. It could be because that you were so sensitive that you were dissociating from the feelings that were there.
Oh yeah, that's a valid frame. So it depends on how you want.
So I have a similar story in that I don't really remember feeling much in a way for a number of years, and then in my early 20s, perhaps it was cannabis use or psychedelics, or just like relationships that really kind of like unlocked emotion and feeling in the world, like really engaging with the world from a deeper place.
Right.
So I'm commenting on that because I see that I've had a similar sort of story there.
Yeah, you're right. So I mean, so in that regard, I think most human beings are actually, kind of like, so there's like the fundamental first order sensitiveness that probably is pre-conscious, right? It's probably just, like you're someone's maybe having a fight, like maybe your parent, like, so if you're a child and your parents are fighting in the next room and you can't even really hear what they're saying, you just sense that there's aggression there and you start tensing up and you don't even know why you're tensing up. So in that sense, your body is sensitive to your environment, but you may not consciously know that's what you're feeling, and you may at some level be invested in not knowing or not admitting this to yourself. So you might be distracting yourself by playing video games or something. And so in that regard, so I would say that there's that kind of basal sensitivity, and then there's a kind of conscious awareness. And so I didn't have the conscious awareness. So if you're asking, am I kind of basal, more or less sensitive? I guess I'm probably more sensitive than the median, but I wouldn't say I'm like a peak sensitive top 5%, top 10%. I'm probably like maybe top 40%-ish. And for a long time, I was very not conscious about it. I was very invested in being the cool guy who wasn't fazed by anything. And, so I spent years trying to be cool, like trying to be unfazed. And I can still do that if I want to. Like I got good at it, right? So, and I got very good at not letting shit affect me visibly. And you can cope with it however you want to cope with it separately. But I realized that that's a very shitty way to. I mean, when you do that, you don't the friends that you make when you are in that kind of headspace / when that's your identity. I'm the guy who's cool and doesn't get fazed. You end up making friends with other cool guys, and not a lot, very few women, by the way, I find. And it's just like that. Like whatever game you're playing, you will end up kind of being drawn to other people playing the same game, and you may find that it's not fun being around those people. Whereas on the other hand, like there's this crowd of empathetic, sensitive, vulnerable people who, sometimes they get too sensitive and sometimes they get too vulnerable. But I find that as a net group, I mostly prefer to be mostly around the sensitive group of people more, because the relationships tend to be more sincere, more honest, more open. But yeah, it was very often when I'm with my sensitive friends, I'm like, okay guys, like, sure, I respect your feelings and everything, but we should also, like if you're getting a little bit too, you're deliberately drowning in your sorrows again and again, like sometimes we should kind of pull back and like, let's go for a walk, let's go and lift some weights, let's do something. And then with my kind of cold, badass friends, I'm like, all right, yeah, you're a bad motherfucker, sure. But like, like why don't we talk about something, like, I mean, I wouldn't literally say talk to me about your feelings, because that usually doesn't work. But I might be like, what's your favorite movie? Why did it move you? That kind of thing. Like, I always want more, I guess. I always want to engage more deeply with the world. And so I'm always trying to find ways to connect with people and with ideas and with everything, basically. We have drifted very far from whatever the question was.
Yeah, no, that's
sensitive.
Fine. Yeah, that's been the conversation,
the theme of our conversation.
Yeah. Well, it's an appropriate time to talk about ADHD because given that we're going everywhere.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Yes. So I have been reading a lot about it over the past year or so, because I thought I had it for a while, and then I really thought I had it last year. Got diagnosed a couple of weeks ago. It's not like I'm not using it as a badge of honor or anything, but just something that the way I see it, like the story of my life was shattered, and then I put it back together in a more coherent way, in a way that makes more sense.
Nice.
And just seeing you on Twitter, just as an observer, I'm like, yeah, this guy, like he's similar to me in these regards. Like, I wonder if he's got ADHD. And then when I was doing some research for this, I thought, oh yeah. So I think you do, from what I remember.
So I've never actually. Right. So I've never actually gotten a diagnosis because I don't. I don't know. I just prefer not getting diagnosed. But I have a friend who is a professional ADHD coach. So she got diagnosed a long time ago, and she has been working with lots and lots of people professionally who have been diagnosed. And I mentioned to her, hey, Anne, I think I might have ADHD. And she laughed. She was like, dude, you have like the strongest case I've ever seen. I'm like, okay. That I trust her judgment based on her experiences working with. So she's not a clinical specialist, but she works with,
but she's
yeah. And like it's so easy to, if you wanted to game the tests to confirm your belief, you can. I mean, you get it. I never even considered that I might have ADHD until I think I met my boss at my previous company, I was like 23 by then. So like throughout my schooling years, like no teacher ever suggested to me that I might have ADHD. They're just like, oh, why are you so unruly? Why are you so distracted all the time? Why are you not paying attention? You're smart. Why can't you focus? Like, and the assumption in Singapore is like, if you can't focus, it's because you're like a stubborn, naughty child.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I've been doing a lot of reading about it over the years, and I have pretty strong feelings about this, and I don't feel compelled to be very scientific about it. So I'm comfortable kind of just ranting and raving about it. And so I say things sometimes like I don't really have ADHD. I have sometimes I joke I don't have attention deficit. I have attention surplus because and I don't, and what I might actually have is more of obedience deficit rather than so I try to experiment with these frames because I think
the frame is terrible. The existing one, ADHD.
Yeah.
But
yeah, so attention deficit hyperactive disorder. Yeah, there's no fun. Right?
No, and
whether you have it or not,
it's characterized by attention deficit in some instances, but hyperfocus in others. Like if I'm doing something I'm interested in, like video games, books, conversations, I found are really where I like really enjoy, where I can just pay 100% attention. Speaking of such things, I just lost it.
Yeah, but exactly right. So I choose to be deliberately playful, irreverent, and because I think there's the mainstream conversation around it is almost it has this kind of slightly like there's undertones of like disability talk, which again, so I have acquaintances who are from like disabled communities and mental health communities, and I don't want to speak on their behalf because I can't relate to that. But like I do remember my boss once talking to me about it, and he said, Visa, he said it's like you struggle to walk, but you have wings. And I'm like, yeah. So does that make me? Is that a disorder? Is it a disorder to like not be able to do what most people can do easier than you, but to be able to do like crazy shit? Like, is that a disorder? Like, then you then investigate the whole premise of what a disorder is altogether, right? It's context dependent. Like, what is disordered in the stable frame? Like in some other context, it's a gift, right? So it's very, and like I joke sometimes things like the solution to ADHD is you just need like personal assistance, like you just need wealth, right? You just need like it's and so it's very, very context dependent. And again, like this goes back to what we were talking earlier about like rigid stories and rigid frames. And ADHD seems like very much a disorder if the only way to succeed in life is to go to school and pay attention and do your homework and all those things. But like, if it leads you to experimenting with crazy things and building amazing things for the world, then, and if you read up about like, I can't remember where I was reading this, but something about just, I think in like shamans and like medicine men and like those kind of people, they seem pretty ADHD-ish. Like they're kind of, they like early on they in their communities, they're kind of talent scouted for being the weird kids that are kind of drifting off into their own worlds. Yeah, and so they get honored by their community to be like, oh, you're clearly like half of you is in this world and half of you is in the spirit world, and like your role in society is to go into the desert or go into the wilderness and find the spiritual treasures and bring them back to civilization and share them with us, translate it to like that's cool. I do feel like in some ways, I think Amanda, I've been following Amanda Palmer recently, and she is an interesting character in this. So she is she's a singer, like a performance artist. She's married to Neil Gaiman, and she's known for her crowdfunding. So she's like very crowdfunded. I think she's like 13,000 patrons or something, and she used to do things like she's like a raw nerve. Like she's super, she sings about like miscarriages and abortions and like just very balls to the wall kind of blood splatter kind of very intense artist. And yeah, I look at her and I think I'm a huge fan. I'm not like, I haven't studied her work in detail, but I just see what she's doing and I'm a big fan of the way she carries herself. And it's very easy to see that if we were in like a tribe or some kind of like pre-civilization environment, she would very obviously be like a priestess of some kind. Like she's just mesmerizing. She's like this larger than life, colorful creature. And yeah, it makes sense that people like that exist now as well. And just there's stuff of, and so school is like this industrial process that sorts people out into like mechanistic cog type things. And so school does not kind of identify who the artists are and who are meant for those roles. And I think it's pretty clear that those roles are necessary in society. And yeah, so the podcasters and the filmmakers and all those people, they need to be directed by their taste. So there's this Elizabeth Gilbert TED Talk that I revisit. So she's the one who wrote Eat, Pray, Love. And she has a TED Talk about the history of genius. So in the past, there were, in like, I think Roman times, Greek times, and other cultures as well, people used to think, like the idea of the muse or the idea of like the genie, like, like that creatives are not entirely responsible for their work because they get visited upon by God or by some spirits or genius or whatever. And, again, like that is kind of like when I think about the experience of ADHD or what ADHD is like to me, it sometimes it's like that. Like I have a joke Twitter account called Visa Brain where I kind of tweet in that voice of that other part of my mind. Where, so Visa Brain is this character who does whatever the fuck he wants, does not listen to me. Like, so it's not like I get to choose what he does. I mean, at the most, I get to veto a thought. Maybe I get to not tweet what he said. That's like the most that I can do. So I'm like, it's like a crazy horse and I'm riding it. And like, I can try my best to, no, don't fly off the cliff. Let's not kill people. But like, when he's interested in something, and if halfway he decides that he's interested in something else, I have no fucking control over that. And that's a good thing, I believe. It's good that he is not constrained by my assumptions, right? Like, so I might start a Twitter thread that's like, hey, I'm going to talk about chili sauce. And then halfway through doing the thread, researching chili sauce, he decides that, hey, we are now in the middle of like Spanish history. And here there is something far more interesting than chili sauce. So we're going to diverge now to talk about colonialism in Spain, in Spanish colonialism of South America. And, so as I develop my own executive function, I get to kind of interrupt him a little bit and be like, hey, do you want to put a pin in this for maybe, and very often the answer is no. But like, so what I have learned to do over time is accept that I cannot really control that process, and accept that process is directed by taste, which is I don't have entire conscious control over what the taste is. And it's basically, right. I think Paul Graham has an essay about how he writes essays, and he says that at every point you just flow interesting. So like a river flows downhill by, it goes this way, and then it's like, okay, this is the easier way to go, this is the easy way to go. And he says that, to write a good essay, like you have to flow interesting. So you, from here, whatever is the most interesting thing, you go there, then you go there. And maybe you find a dead end, and then you got to go back and then find the next interesting thing. And so the coolest essays aren't necessarily like a straight line from here to here. It might be that you got to go to this interesting kind of side path, and then you come there. And that's a far more interesting journey. And so and I think the thing about genius, the thing about ADHD-ish, like even the terminology I'm not so sure about, but like, some people seem to have much more of like a powerful entity within themselves that goes after what that entity thinks is interesting. And we are trained to feel like guilt and shame and whatnot for not sticking to the matter of hand because we have. It's not, in air quotes, productive. It's not. Yeah, but so the thing I always tell people about productivity is, I've collected a lot of anecdotes about this. So when Steve Jobs was dicking around with Wozniak, and they used to want to prank people, and so they learned how to make blue boxes And blue boxes are like these things that kind of mimic the sound of, like, so the way telephones used to work was that there's a bunch of sounds and it uses the sounds like a security verifying thing. I don't know specifics. But basically him and Wozniak were dicking around and trying to prank people and fool around and doing very unproductive things. They were not, trying to make a product. They were just trying to have fun. And they figured out a way to kind of like hack so-called telephone infrastructures. And there's a Jobs quote. I can send it to you later if you want. It's he basically says that Apple would not exist if not for the fact that they had that experience manipulating billions of dollars of telephone infrastructure. And so, if you want an iPhone, you need a couple of hippie nerds to hack shit for the fun of it. Like that's how if you think that, productivity means kind of sitting down and grinding every day, like that's a very narrow downstream view of productivity. That's kind of a, if you're working in the factory making iPhones, yeah, sure. But like if you want them to invent the all the way at the top, like that's a crazy guy who did crazy shit. You need the crazy people at the start, right? Yeah. So I have tons of stories like this. Like Richard Feynman has a story about how he was, trying to do work in physics and he was trying to solve some problem and his heart wasn't in it. He couldn't do it and he was struggling every day. And then eventually he was just kind of sitting in the cafeteria and he saw some guy like spinning trays in the cafeteria. And he is like, why is it that when the tray spins, the outside seems to be spinning faster than the inside? And then, it's a dumb, pointless question, but like he stuck with it. It's like, I want to know. And then he used his physics knowledge to explore. And eventually he found like some spiral equation thing and he showed it to his colleagues and his colleagues were like, okay, what's the point of that? And he's like, it's interesting. That's the point. And then he just kept doing it. And eventually he got to some stuff that he won the Nobel Prize for. But the thing is, he wasn't trying to win the Nobel Prize. He was just having fun.
It's just curious.
He was letting his curiosity drive, right? So the challenge for us is to let the curiosity drive, but to not get into accidents, right? So I am mindful of both. So depending on who I'm talking to, sometimes if I'm talking to people who are like incredibly scared of taking risks, I'm like, dude, you have to let creativity drive. But sometimes if I'm talking to someone who's like super strangely is strangely fearless in like an unhealthy way, I'll be like, okay, like, it's good to take risks, but you should, like your job as the custodian of that trickster animal spirit is to kind of, like make sure they don't go off the rails. Yeah.
So one of the problems with having such scattered attention or interests is that when you're doing something that requires sustained effort for a long period of time, you can get bored with that, and you may end up having, in my case, dozens of unfinished projects. And one of the things that I've seen you write about is about being prolific, and you are quite prolific. You're on your way to 1 million words. I think you're like 75% of the way there or something like that since the past few years.
Yeah.
77.
Yep.
So how do you navigate the balance between creation and how do you stop yourself from perfectionist tendencies, or how does one be prolific when you're constrained in a way by this, or not constrained, but when you've got this fractured attention, or when you're on this crazy horse?
Right. So the only reason to restrain the horse is to prevent harm, like to prevent, like if you're about to say something like cruel and vindictive, like, because that crazy mind has no ethics and no moral, like, it's the kind of shit that says, like, let's so the only reason to restrain it is to prevent like cruelty to others, or like harm, or if your thing says let's withdraw all our money from the bank and go and buy a car, like you have to stop it from doing that kind of crazy shit. But apart from that, like, I believe that you should let the horse run wherever the hell it wants, and your job is to take notes of the journey. Like, so you want to kind of like map out, and you only need to spend like a few minutes actually. Like, so like you should write down your guess of where you think it's going to go, because it's always interesting to see where how you are wrong. And then you should write down at the end. So like, let's say you set out today, you say, I'm going to edit the podcast today. And then the next 4 hours you spend in the weeds reading about audio engineering for some reason, right? You should not feel bad about that. Rather, you should write in your journal or whatever, today I researched audio engineering for 4 hours when I meant to do that. And here's the interesting thing about audio engineering, 1, 2, 3 points, whatever's on your mind. And then like accept that. And then the next day, it's unlikely that you're going to go back to audio engineering again. You might, so it's you don't know for sure, but you just keep track of it. And maybe, at some level, your job is...
You've got those mental meta tags of where to go when you're...
Yes, exactly.
You need to,
and you may... so if you just do that kind of bookkeeping, and you don't need to spend hours on it, like just a few minutes of bookkeeping, it could be that, 1 week in you realize, oh shit, maybe I'm supposed to be an audio engineer. You don't know yet. But so if you just keep track of that if you do it for like a year, like you'll be sold and you'll do it for the rest of your life, because like that meta knowledge is super useful in helping you understand where your horse is going, kind of. And the cool thing is, and I've basically tested this hypothesis for myself, which is that, sometimes people say, oh, I'm so random, I'm so fragmented, like I care about too many things. I believe you can test that hypothesis and you will be proven wrong, because eventually you circle back to the same things. Like nobody is capable of being so infinitely random that they never come back to the same thing twice. And so as long as you've kind of kept a little bit of notes along the way of where you've been, when you come back, you can build off of where you were before. And so it's like, it can be a very so if you imagine like a map, right? And you could be taking like this crazy windy walk around the map. But like, as long as you keep the path of so you want to see the line of where you went. And maybe after a while you notice that, like your path is like, you're going around in big circles and then you circle around this little area a lot. And then you go around a big circle again, and then you circle around this little area a lot. And because now you have the notes from the last time you were there, you may realize that, actually there's an interesting topic there that I should do a blog post about or a podcast about or something like that. And once you have that, then that it like unlocks new options around. So the challenge is really just to map the path that your crazy mind took. And people struggle with this because they feel guilty about it. I mean, one of the best things I've written was like a essay about Mean Girls, which is like a very... None of my friends expected me to write an essay about
the TV, like the movie.
The movie, yeah. And it's super popular. It's got like hundreds of thousands of views, and it helped me make friends with people that I never imagined would... So I've made friends with people in tech when I was working in tech because they read my Mean Girls essay, which is funny because I was trying to get the attention of those people by writing daily, the same boring shit they were reading every day. But yeah, when I wrote about like a movie, people were like, oh, that's an interesting... Oh, this guy works in tech. So it's kind of... Again, like there's no way I could have known that in advance that writing a movie about like a trashy chick lit film was going to get me attention from those guys. And so, but the way you can so once you zoom out and have a few years of experience of doing this, you realize that, again, it's like if you went after something, it's because some part of you was interested in that. And that interest is like the most valuable currency in the world. Like you can't buy it. You can't cheat it. Like it's either you're interested or you're not. And you have to be honest with yourself about what you're interested in. And like, again, your conscious mind can lie to you. Your conscious mind can be like, I need to, like find the most prestigious person and interview them. But then your other part of your mind is like, there's this weird guy down the street who just makes me laugh every week and I want to talk to him. Like you should let your horse go to that guy, because that's the strange thing that will, it's... And once you kind of recalibrate this way, life becomes a lot more surprising, which is fun. Like it's like you never know in advance where your horse is going to take you. So once you know that it's not going to kill you and you can, survive enough, then it's like, all right, horsey, where are we going to go? And you're like, I think I'm going to research this. And then like halfway through, you're like, oh, I guess this is where we're going today. And then
so where does your horse take you?
Well, so right now I told myself that I wanted to write an essay about aesthetics, and I have like a draft of it, and I've been working on it. But
so what is
at some
aesthetics
level,
mean?
it's aesthetic.
What is it like? The uninitiated.
I mean, so aesthetics is in like my definition of aesthetics is it's a system of... It's an internally consistent system of beauty, I guess, or a system of what is good and what is right. And so, you could say everything can potentially be the seed of a whole system of aesthetics. So like, there's like Alien, the movie, there's a whole aesthetic around that of like fear and the anxiety. what's a good way to explain this? Most good movies have some aesthetic about them. Most good video games also have some aesthetic about them.
Would you say an aesthetic is like this intangible thing that it's like a characteristic that you may not be able to put your finger on, but it's defining, and it's some sort of quality that is emergent, and you couldn't codify it, or you couldn't write it down as like a set of, like,
you can't
write it out, but
you can try. You can try to come up with like a phrase or a sentence or like a brief of what it is like and what it's not like. But the cool thing is that it's something that can adapt and evolve. So like you could start out with one kind of aesthetic and it starts to drift a little bit in a certain way. But I think the phrase that I enjoyed using was an aesthetic is almost it's like a cinematic universe, right? So imagine like you have a really nice black and white scarf, right? Like just beautiful. Someone gave you a very, very nice black and white scarf and you got it and you're like, oh wow, like I like this black and white aesthetic. And then you're like, maybe like I want to hang the scarf on my door or something. And then you look around and you're like, a chair that matches the scarf would be nice. And it may not necessarily be also black and white. Maybe it'll be black or white, but like you're like, and then accidentally you start building out this whole aesthetic around, like now you realize your whole room has that kind of bizarre, and maybe towards the it started out with the scarf, but now your whole room is black and white, and there are many different kinds of black and white aesthetics. So it might be a comic book style black and white, or it might be some kind of weird like a photocopy machine glitch kind of black and white, and you may not know where you're going with the aesthetic when you started, but like by each new thing that you introduce to that aesthetic space, it's like songwriting, maybe like adding another riff or adding another piece of something. It kind of modifies the whole vibe a little bit, and then so it's like playing with vibes. And I make the case that just as so far I tend to talk to people about this in terms of fashion or in terms of visual aesthetics, because that's kind of very easy to see. What's less easy to see is that every visual aesthetic also implies an intellectual aesthetic and ethical aesthetic, maybe even so everybody is embodying some set of aesthetics so it's very intertwined with story as well. So like the story you tell is tied up in your aesthetics, and how you tell the story is a form of your aesthetics. The objects you use, the colors, so I like for when I started work in 2013, all of my t-shirts were black and white. It wasn't a super deliberate choice, but like I was just kind of I don't know, I didn't want to think about my clothes, I guess, and I wanted it to be as simple as possible. But now I'm like, I try to have bold blues and greens and yellows and reds, and it's just I try to introduce as much color as possible into my wardrobe. And I don't know where exactly I'm going with that. I just know that I don't want to be the guy always wearing black and white t-shirts. And just, once I'm already wearing blue and gold and what colorful t-shirts, I start to find that, it feels a little, it's very, very subtle, but it feels like I'm a bit more vibrant as a person even. It's very, very subtle. And then people talk to me slightly differently. They're all micro adjustments. And like, it'll be weird to tell someone like, oh, I changed the colors of my shirt and now my whole life is different. But in a sense, that is true. It's just, it was the kind of like micro shift that then you shift the next
1 degree shift now, but like, in 1,000 kilometers, you could be very, very far from where you were initially aiming
at. Exactly. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So, I have like, I've been collecting jewelry, and when I was in San Francisco, I painted my nails, and that was, like people would talk to me all the time. Like women would chat me up saying, "Oh, I love your nails," and it's such a interesting. But again, I'm talking entirely about fashion, and I would say, so there's
the most salient examples in a way. Yeah.
Yeah. So when I used to go to this flotation club. I mean, so it's a place that offers, you can pay cash to spend like an hour or two, an hour and a half in sensory deprivation tanks. So these are like floating, there's Epsom salt in the water, and you can lie in the bathtub and close the lid and you just kind of meditate or float. And it was a very peaceful experience for me. Like it's very kind of zen, kind of chill, and like you get to be alone with your thoughts in the middle of the day, and it's pitch black, and I recommend it to anybody who wants to try it. And I remember the first time I had that experience, I stepped out and there was, like I remember so much about that experience. Like I remember the place that it was. I remember the plants they had outside. It has this very, like the floor was like polished concrete and it's very big open space with like big glass windows and the sun was coming in and it just felt very, it wasn't entirely nature-ish, but it was very chill and kind of welcoming. And there was a song playing on the speakers by a band called Kruang Bin. I think that's how you pronounce it, Kruang Bin. It's like a Thai band, and it's just this very chill, mellow song, like kind of slow and beach vibes kind of thing. And now that song has to me become like a seed, like an aesthetic seed. So like I can use the song to recreate an entire state of mind for me. So it's not just, so if I'm feeling stressed, I can put on that song, and it's not just the song that chills me out and makes me mellow out, but it's also the associated memory with all the float tanks and there's like Buddha statues and it just the whole place had that vibe, and I can kind of carry that vibe with me in that song, right? And I can subsequently, if I so choose, I can, and anybody can do this. So you can choose to kind of so this gets into slightly wooey territory, but it's really just a game of associations. You can choose to charge an object with narrative meaning through a ceremony that you create yourself. And I mean, people instinctively understand this by like, maybe there was a song that plays when you're walking down the aisle with your spouse when you're getting married. And now that song has been imbued with meaning for you. And every time you hear the song, you think of your spouse. Like I said, you can actually do that with any object at any time that you want to be, if there's something you want to be reminded of, you can get a tattoo if you want, right? And so there's just this sense of you have the freedom to weave your stories and your meaning into your objects, into your music, into your clothes, into how you decorate your house, the books you own. And there will be some sort of order to how you do it. And that order is based on your mind, right? So it might look disordered to somebody else, but it makes perfect sense to you. You might put, imagine like a sculpture of like a toilet and a sculpture of like something like sacred, and to you that is something profound. It's like the merging of the sacred and like somebody else might look at it and go, what the fuck, that's stupid or that's disturbing, but to you it means something significant. And so the internal logic that you have of the objects in relation to each other and in relation to you, that's your aesthetic. I have never managed to articulate that before, so thanks. I'm going to use that.
No worries. It made me think of like life itself as the ultimate act of art, or it is the ultimate art form. Just how you choose to live.
Yeah.
So social media. I mean, this all came to be because of social media, and many people lambast social media for reasons we don't need to get into. But you have obviously used it for tremendously useful and what I would say is positive, for positive reasons, or in positive ways. So what do you think of, how do you think social media will evolve and perhaps needs to evolve, or should or could evolve in a way that would maximize for connection and good things all around, promote human flourishing and maybe avoid some of the negative things from your experience?
Right. So I don't know if, so sometimes people ask me for things like proposals for like modifying kind of the mechanics of how social media works, which I don't feel confident and qualified to give a lot of suggestions on that front, because I feel like you have to study it closely and you have to consider like the unintended consequences and stuff like that. But what I do know and what I care about is a very individual centric approach, which is, so I'm not gonna expect any of the social media products or companies to solve this for us. I think it's really I choose to focus on what I can control. And so my friend Anna Gut, she had this tweet that was like, I think I live in some kind of weird bubble where all of my friends online are, they are super curious, and they're replying to each other with thanks for the clarification, and I'm not sure I understand you. Like, this kind of very, very tentative thing. And she's like, I feel like I live in this weird bubble. And I retweeted that with, my goal in life is to expand this bubble as much as possible. And yeah, I think when people see, when common, I mean, I can't speak for everybody, but I believe that there's a very large group of people who, if and when they encounter this bubble themselves, they can see for themselves that it's self-evident that such a bubble is healthy and good. I mean, I can't speak on behalf of people who have been almost radically weaponized in the culture wars, and they're like, they go online with the intent of who can I yell at today. But yeah, so this is what my accelerating hypermedia idea is about. So the idea is just that social media is nowhere as social as it could be, in the sense that, it's optimized for publishing, and it's my friend Andrew, he said it's optimized for consumption, not connection. And yeah, basically, if social media really cared about they could do sentiment analysis, and if you're about to tweet something uncharitable, it could prompt you, are you sure you want to tweet this nasty thing to somebody else? But the platform incentivizes that, because people yelling at each other is great engagement, which is great for ads and blah blah blah. But yeah, so we want to develop community norms in our little bubble, and invite more and more people to participate, where within this group of people kind of socially reward each other for being charitable, for supporting each other, and for when they disagree kind of as civilly as possible. And I think I've already seen it happen. So when I started, so I now have 12,000 Twitter followers, which is a blessing. And I have people who have told me that them witnessing me do what I do has influenced how they interact with other people. And so the bubble is expanding. And so the challenge, I think it's one of those things where the best thing I can do is to just keep focusing on expanding the bubble. And, even having this conversation with you and with your listeners is kind of like an invitation to join the bubble, in a sense. And I think if that becomes more and more, the bigger the bubble gets, the more people will take notice. And maybe there may be some I can't predict whether that's going to turn out well all the way through. There may be some unforeseen conflicts and whatnot down the road. In fact, I anticipate that past a certain point, there will almost definitely be some bad shit that will happen that you can't foresee. But still, I think that the most fundamental principles of going all the way back to the library, and the internet is a library you can participate in, and just the fundamental promise of the internet to me was that if you are kind and earnest and nerdy, you can build out a network of correspondence with other kind, friendly nerds around the world. They just need to know who you are and where you are, and they need to be able to contact you, and you need to be able to contact them. And yeah, so I almost disregard the shit flinging, crazy, wild. You can't really save them. I mean, I don't know. I don't possess the patience and the I've tried before, and you can spend hours and not get anywhere. And so I've come around to, there's always more interesting kind nerds outside your social graph that you don't currently know about. So I'm always trying to find the others. So I'm constantly where are the other, curious, kind, non-pedestally kind of players, people who are playing in a playful way. And yeah, I think there's several hundred of us that I know of on Twitter-ish. And if we can get that to the thousands, maybe there'll be something to look forward to.
Yeah, that sounds I'd love to see that happen. It's a great bubble. From I'm thinking of a few people who may be in that bubble, and I enjoy the way they engage the world around them, and it's definitely made my life more positive. So I guess we'll come up to we'll wrap up shortly. Just a few quick rapid fire questions I want to throw you away.
Rapid fire.
What was rapid fire? What was the last thing you changed your mind on?
Last thing I changed my mind on was probably travel. I think when I was younger, I thought of travel as something like, I mean, I always sort of thought of travel as, it sounds good, sounds like a good thing to do, but I wasn't drawn to it. I think I didn't appreciate so my wife is big on travel. Like, she loves to travel, and she traveled on her own when she was younger, and she would try and persuade me to travel. And I'm like, what do you want to see? Like, you can see stuff online, you can see stuff, you can watch videos and stuff. Like, do we really need to like pack our shit and go somewhere else just to see stuff? Like, the internet is not so good, and stuff like that. But having traveled more, and I think particularly now having met people, I realized that travel is really, it's about experiencing different ways of being, and being somewhere that is unfamiliar and strange. It's not just about what you see over there, right? It's finding out what about yourself is kind of context dependent to your current context that you're not aware of because you are in your current context. So travel becomes this it's so how I sell it to myself now is that travel is practically a psychedelic experience. It's like you go somewhere and everything's different, and you have to it's the closest thing left, I think, to a kind of adventure that you can have. Mm-hmm. It depends on how you frame it. So if you're going to go for like travel guided tours and stuff, that's not so thing. But if you go somewhere and you kind of improvise your way through, and if you have friends abroad and you can meet them, like, that stuff is fun. And I regret not traveling more when I was younger. Yeah, but so I'm looking to correct that. Maybe I'll come and find you in Australia.
Yeah. Well, down in Sydney, you're always welcome. It's a good place. Sweet. It's a good place. What are some of the books or documentaries, essays that have impacted you the most?
Books. Okay, so the books,
authors as well, like just general authors.
I would say, so I somebody challenged me to describe myself in terms of authors and like speakers and whatnot, and I like to describe myself as a little bit of Mr. Rogers, who's like that friendly neighborhood guy on TV. A bit of Alan Watts. Alan Watts is probably my primary influence in terms of like spirituality, playfulness. A bit of George Carlin. So Carlin was more of a cynical social theorist comedian. And I would also add Hayley Williams. So Hayley from Paramore, the singer. Like, she has this very so it was my favorite band when I was a teen, and what I enjoy about her is, even lyrically, she has this message of like hope and like earnestness, and like as a kind of leader of a band and a fan base, like, she has this very nurturing perspective, and I try to embody that. So those are people. As for books, there's this book by Lewis Thomas, who's not very famous. He was this like science biology watcher / essayist from the 70s, and he had this very big picture view of things, and he predicted the internet like in the 70s based on like comparing how like life forms evolve from single cell organisms to complex organisms, and like he said that thoughts were kind of coalescing and becoming like, eventually all thoughts would be part of a network the same way like coral reefs and stuff. And he had many short essays like these where he would examine the earth as a single celled organism with a membrane protecting it, and he would talk about how nation states are kind of like selfish individuals that don't trust each other, and he just has all these interesting biology grounded metaphors for making sense of reality, and it's very poetic and musical, so I enjoyed him a lot. Apart from Lewis Thomas, Alan Watts, David Ogilvy, the advertising guy, if you read his memoir, his autobiography, he has this very cheerful, he has kind of he manages to walk this tightrope of being self-confident but not insufferable. So like, he knows what he's good at, and he speaks confidently with conviction. And yet, like he says, I know what's good, and I go after, like, this is what I do, this is what works, this is what gets results. And he also is like able to be self-deprecating in a way. Like, I think he was talking about when one of his partners left the company, and he said something like, I am glad that he can now flourish unburdened by an insufferable partner like me. So, he has this very charming, classy guy who's like, and that he built a company that was, like, at its time, it was like very well known. So, great taste, great writer. So that's Ogilvy. Who else? Ellen Watts, Ogilvy, Lewis Thomas. I feel like I should include at least one more. Let me pick, let's pick a woman. Let's say Jeanette Winterson. So Jeanette Winterson she's still around, and her book, Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal. That's the title of one of her autobiographies, which is already, you get the sense, right? Like she has this sensitivity, and she talks about being kind of, she said, I think there's a line that was like, I found myself dashed onto the shores of humankind and finding it not very human and not very kind. Like, she's this very like great sense of drama and
playful,
and like playful, and also there's like, so she was like an adopted child, and her mom who adopted her was not very good at being a parent, and just she navigates that very skillfully. And there's playfulness, but then there's also like anger and sadness, but it's all very well managed. So I think that's quite a nice thing to learn from. Oh, and I guess I would pick, I'm looking at my bookshelf now, I would pick Richard Feynman as well. Like, surely you're joking, Mr. Feynman. Yeah, there's a fun line that's like, it's the thing that I tell people is that with books, it's never so much about what they say, but how they say it. So it's I'm not looking to find like, oh, they said this is a quote, then the quote is amazing, and I'm going to hold the quote to my heart. It's more of like, how do they see the world, or how do they navigate the world? So it's like I try to inherit their way of seeing. So it becomes like I'm collecting lenses that I can swap in with. Like, I can borrow, how would Ogilvy respond to this, or how would Winterson respond to this, or how would Feynman respond to this? And that it's like having this council in your head, that's like an advisory board, which is great.
And last question. If you could just spread a message of anything, if you could just leave a parting message to the listeners, what would that be?
Parting messages to listeners. I would say, let me think. All right. So I believe that every person has, so this, I'm going to enter slightly wooey territory, but I mean, you can translate this into secular stuff. I'm just going to talk about it like directly, which is that I believe that everybody has a certain voltage, and like you can try and find some kind of maybe you can measure it in emotional resonance, and you can go into an MRI and look at the brain, or you can talk about nerve endings and stuff like that. But I'm talking in a more symbolic kind of sense. Like, everybody has a voltage, which is the amount of energy, emotional energy. I don't know if there's such a thing as psychic energy. I believe that this is what, when you read about, like in Chinese texts, you read about qi, and you read in like Hindu texts, or like Indian stuff talking about like, unblocking your chakras. Like, there's all these, it's interesting that whether or not you believe those things are literally true, it's interesting that there, in like Polynesian culture, there's this idea of mana, right? Like, and it's interesting that in all these different cultures, there's this concept of some kind of life force. I guess some people might say it's your soul. And, without being too eager to say, that doesn't exist, there's no scientific proof for that. Like, this, it's interesting that so many different cultures all kind of have the same vague idea of this kind of energy. And I'm going to suggest that maybe we could consider this kind of energy as a kind of emotional energy, maybe, or like a narrative energy. It's just how much like confidence and conviction with which you can have your actions, and that's contextualized by the story that you're in, right? And I believe that, and you could call it like the sacred flame, maybe. There's so many, like Prometheus and the flame, there's so many metaphors for this, but there's some kind of energy or life force. So however this resonates with you, it might, and if it's totally bullshit, then disregard it. But if something is resonating, consider what the expression of your sacred flame, or your voltage, or your chi, or your mana, or consider what the expression of that is, and think about what it would be like to turn that up, right? And so, like, the objects around you, your friends around you, everybody, your entire life is kind of a manifestation of that energy. It's how excited are you to wake up in the morning, right? Like, when you wake up in the morning, if you have a friend flying in from across the planet that you're really looking forward to meeting, you get excited. You're like, oh fuck, I can't wait to wake up and go and meet this guy for lunch. And you can so that is the obvious kind of great thing to look forward to. And sometimes it's like some terrible shit that you don't want to look forward to, and then you feel the energy levels dip. You're like, I gotta go to file my taxes, or some dumb shit that you don't want to do. And so that's kind of like, I think, the spectrum of like your energy level. Again, I use the word energy very flippantly. I don't know what I'm talking about, but like, once you consider that, and then consider that there's probably some kind of baseline level of where your energy is, your mana, whatever you want to call it, right? I call it voltage from fun. And like the objects in your life and the books on your shelf and everything kind of adds up into kind of you will be at some level of homeostasis. Like you will be at some level that you have deemed appropriate. So like how much excitement you bring to a party, or to how kind of energetically you throw yourself into your work, like whatever it is that you're doing, like you bring some level of that thing with you, your spirit, mana, whatever thing with you. And I just invite you to consider, what would it take to turn that dial up? Like you're probably, the average person is probably at like a 6 or a 5. If you're listening to the podcast, maybe 6.5-ish, 7. Like just for fun, just imagine what it would be like to turn it up to 10, turn it up to 11. And like if you went crazy and you just freaking, like lightning bursting through your veins, like what would your life look like then? Like how violently would you modify your, like what would that kind of violent expression look like for your clothes, would you wear makeup? I mean, that's the visual element. Would you seek out friends? Would you travel? Would you suddenly, like if your voltage went all the way up, would you suddenly pick up motorbike racing? Just kind of wild flights of fancy. Just consider what a high voltage life might look for you, and then from there, maybe ask yourself, what would it be like if you turned it up a little bit? And then, I believe that once you just start experimenting with those questions, you will probably find that actually you could live a higher voltage life than you're currently living. You would probably enjoy it, and you just haven't done it yet because nobody ever encourages you to do it, because higher voltage life is a more volatile life. It's a more unpredictable life. It's the potential. There's more potential upside, and there's also more potential downside. And nobody wants to. You tell your friend, "Hey, go and do something crazy," and then they come back and they're like injured or something, and then you're like, "Oh, it's your fault that I went cliff diving and broke my leg." So I'm not saying you should go cliff diving, but you should consider what your equivalent of going cliff diving would be, and have that kind of articulate that for yourself. And, maybe make plans to consider doing some of it and live a more passionate, excited life. Yeah, that's my invitation. Turn up the voltage, guys.
Turn that shit up. Beautiful.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Visa, it's been an absolute pleasure.
It's mine
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me. It's been fun.